Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders, viewable on YouTube and at Prime TV. Today, I'm delighted to introduce the leadership team of the Kelsey. We'll talk a little bit about the Kelsey in a moment, but that leadership team consists of Micaela, Connery, co-founder and CEO, Justin Tsang, who is a board member, and also a transportation planner at LA Metro, and Capri, Roth, board member, and also the executive vice president of real estate development at East Bay Asian Local Development Corporation, EBALDC. It's great to see you all here to talk about this magnificent organization, the Kelsey, and also to talk about the whole question of how do we ensure that people who are disabled receive housing and are set up for their own success in life. Thank you so much, Micaela and team, for helping us to understand this really important issue. So, Micaela, I'd like to just sort of jump in because the Kelsey is actually means something. The name itself means something. Could you talk a little bit about Kelsey O'Connor and the reason that the Kelsey is named for Kelsey?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite things to talk about. So our co-founder, Kelsey, was my cousin and friend, and she and I were born 3 months apart, and so kind of went through every life milestone together. And Kelsey was a person who lived with multiple significant disabilities. She used 24-hour care. She used modified sign language to communicate. She had some medical support needs. And so she lived with disabilities that, impacted a lot of elements of her life. And when she became an adult, there was a huge gap in what options were available to her for community-based housing. And that was despite actually growing up in very inclusive and integrated settings in her schools and her church and her recreation. Yet when she became an adult, those options were super limited. And what I initially thought was just an issue specific to who Kelsey was and where she lived or what resources were available, I learned very quickly were not specific to Kelsey, but were an example of a much larger systemic issue impacting the, 70 million Americans with disabilities, Kelsey being one of them, but not the only one facing housing barriers. And so the organization, the Kelsey, formed out of her advocacy and leadership and in her legacy. Her legacy is embedded across a lot of different areas that we do. But I'd also say in particular, making sure that we build disability forward housing where disabled people are a part of the process and solution and leadership and advocacy and shaping of those solutions. And in particular, that our housing opportunities include people with higher support needs and, among all types of disabilities, that we're not leaving out folks who use supportive services. And we've really anchored our disability forward housing models on including that. And last but not least, I also didn't mention that Kelsey also used a wheelchair. So she had physical, she had developmental, she had health related, she had sensory, she had all different types of disabilities. And so you'll also see through Kelsey's legacy this anchoring on cross disability, really making sure that we aren't segmenting people by a particular diagnosis or this or that, but really building models that anchor on disability and can serve the diversity of access and community living needs.
So, Justin, as an LA Metro planner, it's really interesting that you're involved with this particular organization. When I get up from this desk, I'm sitting in a chair. I can get up. I'm ambulatory. I don't need a wheelchair. I can then walk to my car, and I can drive on a road. If I took public transportation, I can stand in line and take public transportation. I mean, that's kind of your world, right? Your world is serving people like me. And Micaela is talking about another world where somebody can't just get up, cannot just walk over to that car, cannot just get into it, cannot just drive. And now you, as a LA Metro planner, you're placing yourself in the crossfire of people who are not generally thought about by people like yourself. Talk a little bit about your day job, and how this involvement on the board enriches your own thinking of how Los Angeles Metro ought to work for everyone.
Sure. I just want to give a disclaimer that my views are mine alone and not of the agency.
Right.
But I would say that as a disabled transportation planner, part of my work is involved with a coalition group that is partnered with Metro. And so every single month, I work with a coalition that includes staff members, disabled advocates from independent living centers, well as our users and committee members who are part of our accessibility council. And so we talk about various initiatives ranging from fairs to the 28 Olympics in terms of planning, emergency planning. But all of these factors are critical to mobility for disabled people. And what makes the Kelsey so unique is its unique integration of affordable, accessible housing as well as advocacy. I lived as a person facing multiple housing barriers from applying housing to securing housing. Um, and unfortunately, before I attended college, I did live in a institution for disabled people. But after graduating, I was in a HUD internship in DC where I learned more about different housing programs, particularly on Section 811, which is specific for disability needs. Um, and yeah, it is always a pleasure learning about the work that the Kelsey does. And the Kelsey's mission has always been truly in my heart as something that's innovative and a critical need for the disabled community.
So when you talk about disability, you're talking about different types of abilities and different needs. So, for example, if I have visual impairments, right, I have certain needs. If I have hearing impairments, I have certain needs. If I have a physical issue, I live with amputation, or I live with a neurological disorder that means that I'm not able to necessarily control my musculature, or I have digestive issues, or I have some other issues, right? You're thinking in terms of that person's life. It might not be your life, but you're thinking about that person's life and that person's navigation, isn't it?
Correct. Um, Disability is not a monolith. There are many people with different socioeconomic statuses, as well as different life experience and how they get to places from their own homes. And so we have to think of all these kind of solutions that have to work together.
So, when I asked Justin Capri about this whole idea of metro planning and how metro planning very often is done for the mean person, in other words, the average person, as opposed to the individual needs person. You have the same kind of a situation at EBALDC. You're planning for housing, but not every one of your plans are for each individual need of each individual subset of person. Talk a little bit about your participation in this board and how that intersects with the work that you do at EBALDC.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, I came to the organization sort of through just professional advocacy networking. We are affordable housers both, and met that way. And I was really interested in the work they were doing and started volunteering as a mentor in one of their kind of collective advocacy, collective power building groups that they hosted. And through that, I really just saw sort of this is a really critical missing space in the affordable housing industry. And I can say that as someone who has been not just with EBALDC, but with other affordable housing developers in my career, where certainly we do think about accessibility in the design of our housing and the programming, but not to your highlight with that kind of really encompassing and cross-disability view. I think there's a lot of sort of heavy emphasis on compliance with requirements, which of course, really focuses on mobility impairment kind of first and foremost, and on, hearing and visual disability. We think about, what percentage of my units will have features that accommodate people with these disabilities. And to your highlight, the actual end users in our properties oftentimes are representing a really wide range of different disabilities or access needs. And I don't feel like as an industry, affordable housers have the tools that we need to rise and meet that moment and to really be providing the kind of sort of thriving housing environment that we want that serves our mission to meet our residents where their needs are. And so I both wanted to be a resource to the Kelsey as a experienced developer with my perspective, but also I wanted to be more involved so that I could learn from the Kelsey and incorporate a lot of their expertise and learnings into my own work.
I want to ask you all a question about civil society and what the duty we have as members of a civil society to support those who are different than us. It's a big, big question, right? If I don't have a disability right now, do I have a responsibility to support somebody who has a disability? What is your answer to that, Micaela?
So I think I think there is a broader, not disability specific, but a broader expectation of civil society that, all different types of people should be included and cared for, and that the functioning community is one where all different types of people are able to contribute and thrive and have their needs met. I shifted a little bit, though, from thinking about disability and disability forward housing in the sense that we do it as like a responsibility, just because I caution us that, historically we have actually thought of serving people with disabilities as a responsibility, and that's actually led to things like institutionalization and programs that maybe were seen as part of our responsibility to help, but actually we're sort of laced with paternalism or ableism. And so that's sort of where our concept of disability forward comes in, which is our belief that actually by anchoring on the overlooked and unmet housing needs and community services needs of people with disabilities that have been too long overlooked and ignored, when we anchor on those issues and make sure they're not overlooked, we actually create better experiences for all people. And so
you're correcting two things. I'm sorry for interrupting, but I think you just made two very important points in correcting me. You corrected me in this idea of responsibility. Instead, what you're saying is that there's an embrace, and it's a mutual embrace. It's right. It's people embracing each other, and just meeting each other where you live. And I think the other correction that you made is that if we take a look at a strong civil society, right? It's attitudinal, but it's also a matter of what does constitute a strong civil society. There's an attitudinal issue that you corrected, right? Unconscious as it might be. But there's also this issue of what does constitute a strong civil society, and does this type of inclusion make us all stronger? And I think those are really very important points. Does Capri, Justin, do you want to weigh in on those topics?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I would add is that when people with disabilities have their access needs met, there's not a need for someone else to take care of them in the same way, right? So I think part of the centering of disability inclusion and creating housing and public spaces that are accessible, it can shift that dynamic that you're talking about, that kind of implied assumption that somebody with a disability needs to be taken care of or needs to be accommodated. And some, if you inherently design your programs, your buildings, your landscapes, your transit systems in ways that are accessible and inclusive, then everyone is able to participate in a more equal way. And I think that just really opens up that kind of connection building that Micaela is talking about.
Right. So Justin, when you're designing something for somebody who has a visual impairment as a young person, well, I as an old person could have I could have vision loss. That's going to help me, right? I as somebody who gets sick and might need a different type of access. That's going to help me. You're basically designing for everybody, as we go through different circumstances, right?
Absolutely. I think that, collaborative between both disabled led as well as other professionals and as well as cleaners working together to deliver a really inclusive experience is really key. The Kelsey has its own design standards, and we have a partnership with Lincoln Architecture, and within that we formed what's called a inclusive design council collaboration. So we basically prioritize cross-disability and disability forward decisions together. And it ultimately resulted in covering over 300 elements, both on the interior and exterior spaces and public spaces. With working with how to design, working with different design choices, as well as many of the building features that are built on universal design, as well as features that are also works in operations. I think that with on the operations side, we can ensure that everyone who is a resident has a inclusive experience and is welcomed in our spaces as well.
Micaela, could you elucidate a little bit on what Justin was talking about your design partnerships? That's very
Yes. So we created something in partnership with an architect, Eric Micatin, and an inclusive design council of disabled advocates and designers from across the country. We created in 2021 something called the Inclusive Design Standards. They're available open source, and they are a set of guidelines for how to develop, build, and operate inclusive, accessible, disability-forward housing. And I think a couple of things that are really powerful about them, besides what Justin touched on, which is one, that they were really co-created with people with disabilities to hear from folks of what actually would make housing better. The second is that they also bring together a bunch of other standards that are out there that may be about environmental or racial justice or sustainability and bring those through a disability lens. So it's also sort of an amalgamation of best practices from a lot of different areas and bringing disability into all of them. And then I think last but not least, what they get to, and I think this is a really key part of a key sort of missing piece in affordable housing or really any housing overall, is that often when we think about accessibility, we're really singularly focused on the built environment as it relates to construction and building components and dwelling units. And those all matter. And those are a huge part of our inclusive design standards. What we heard from people with disabilities is that so much of whether a community is truly accessible and inclusive and affordable has to actually do with bookends in that, which are the process of which a site or a development is conceived. So where a project's located, located, what transit is nearby it, who's on the development team, what are the principles of the building, who was consulted during the process of design and development, that really impacts a community's ultimate access and inclusion. And then on the back end is the operations of a building. You can have a really well-intended design, and then, you design it and then you operate it, in a more traditional way or without thinking about that intentionality. And then all the work you did in accessibility sort of goes away. And so there's a whole part of the inclusive design standards around operations and amenities for things like how are services delivered, what is the lease-up process like, what supports do residents have, what's kind of the culture and ethos in the building, what amenities are offered. And so the inclusive design standards really are a comprehensive set of guidelines to think holistically about how to build housing that is accessible from a cross disability perspective, at all elements of what creates true sort of housing community.
In many respects, isn't the work that is being done at the Kelsey, you're not only serving people directly, but you're also, it's sort of the way you seem to function is almost as a testing platform for ideas, for input, for different sensibilities, and this is not all sweetness and light. There are going to be disagreements amongst different constituents in the approaches that are being taken. But what you're actually doing is you're testing these ideas in real time and then sharing them with other people, and then you're bringing in other experts, right, architects and so on, to make their contributions, right?
Yeah, and I'd kick it to Capri because I think that Capri actually has brought her team from EBALDC through our community in San Jose. And that's, really by design at the Kelsey, which is, we're in a discussion around nonprofits. I think what's interesting is I get asked on a lot of grants, what makes your organization unique or the best or different? And I often want to say, I hate that question. I don't want our organization to be unique or different, maybe the best, because we do like to do what we do really well. But we actually want what we do to be out into the field and for other people to take up and actually other people to adopt and internalize as their own and feel like they have as much, stake and ownership in this. Our chief housing officer, Caroline, recently said in a staff meeting, our mission at the Kelsey is not to create disability forward housing. Our mission is to make sure disability forward housing gets created. And we want, everybody to be doing that, not just us. And so Capri, I think, is a great example of that, where yes, she sits on the Kelsey board and is incredibly supportive of our work, but is an example of somebody in the field that we hope will take this forward.
So, when you're looking at, we know EBALDC. We recruited one of your chief executives in the past. When you look at the development of an organization like EBALDC, and you're looking at how you're being informed by your involvement with the Kelsey, how do you take those two elements and bring them together in a way that allows EBALDC to shift its sensibility, which has happened over time, to embrace some of these ideas and then bring into your organization not only some of this expertise, but also have that expertise inform your project priorities and how you go about developing your assets?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because I think, in all candor, and Micaela knows this, sort of, EBALDC is not, our mission is not to be disability forward, but we are an inclusive organization. We want to serve our residents' needs in the best ways we can. And I think to Micaela's point, I took our real estate team on a tour of the Kelsey AO station in San Jose shortly after it opened. And our real estate development team came back very enthused. We have the design standards. We had a project that was just about to go into its design development phase. And we worked with our architect to say, hey, let's put these design standards into practice in this. And it was that ability to look and point to a real operationalized example and see how this is, and to do it early enough in the process of this development to be able to make a lot of interventions at a pretty cost neutral way. So rather than trying to throw these on as accessibility accommodations that we would make, during operations, because we have a resident who needs an accommodation, we can build them into the design up front and have it be a part of the development and not really impact our project budgets in ways that ultimately will make the long-term operations of the property that much more healthy.
As the VP for real estate development, that's a really interesting point, right? Because your world is about costs, right? It's about cost allocations, it's about costs, it's about efficiency and so on. What you're basically suggesting is that the more efficient way to do this is to think ahead, integrate into the planning, and you're saying that in many cases, did I understand this correctly, that these decisions are actually cost neutral if they're done early enough?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's, I have to say on a, really just dollar for dollar basis, if you make these design decisions early and intentional in the process, the actual cost to construct and, just build out the design is really the same. You're not talking about different cabinets, you're talking about a different cabinet configuration, right? Like just as an example. So it's, but if you have already installed the cabinets and you have to rip them out and now put in a cabinet that doesn't have the under sink so that somebody can get in to work at their sink if they have a chip, that's the costly part.
So you get better at the same cost. Justin, do you find this also to be the case, at an LA County level as you're doing your planning? Are you finding that if you make these decisions early enough, that many of these decisions end up being cost neutral and you get better for less in essence?
Absolutely. Transportation planning, is in different phases. We go through environmental, we go through design and land acquisition, as well as construction. And if we have the budget planned early with our specific requirements, we can get it, close to be on time, and we're not going to be spending over our expected budget. I think what is challenging, especially with larger mega projects, that sometimes we encounter a utility pole that is blocking part of a new railway or something that's has to be relocated, and that adds costs. But if you do the analysis beforehand, you can kind of mitigate that cost.
So, Micaela, we're coming to the end of our time. I'd like to get back to Kelsey, because I got this sense that when we as human beings talk in theoretical terms, we get worse outcomes. Our thinking is less rigorous than when we talk in personal terms. The thing that really strikes me about the story of Kelsey and your story and the co-founding of this organization is that you're able to constantly bring it back to very personal terms, right? And it seems like your team is always thinking in very personal terms. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the culture of an organization that creates that kind of focus, and how do you preserve that culture as there is distance between the founder's departure from this world and the organization that continues to thrive? How do you keep things that present and that grounded in today's reality?
when I think about, talking about things in hypothetical is, I didn't share at the beginning, but, the Kelsey from our founding, we often call ourselves a dual mission organization. We build communities and we change systems. And I think when it comes down to things like our systems change work, and which includes, our advocacy and our policy change and things like the inclusive design standards and, things like advocating for more federal support for this type of housing, et cetera, having another part of our team be actually serving people in those models and be a resident facing in a housing development, having that feedback loop between them and keeping that core to our work and making sure those parts of our mission don't get too far apart is so critical, because we're able to say, 811, as Justin pointed out, is a critical federal program. And let me tell you about these 5 residents and more, who would not have had housing without this program. And I can tell you their name and where they lived before living in this community and what this program did for them. And I can also tell you about what was challenging for them to access it and what could be improved on the program to make it more, impactful. Or with the inclusive design standards, I can tell you about, a resident in their unit and the fact that living at the Kelsey was the first time they could ever wash their hands because the counters were structured in a way that they could actually get under their sink and do that. And here's the design element that allowed that. And here's a resident and a story. And so I think what you touch on is not just, what I'm incredibly proud of is while Kelsey is a fundamental part of that human story of the Kelsey, and her portrait hangs in the lobby of our building, what's really powerful is that now actually the human component of the impact of what we do is really in our residents. And we're able to say, if you make this policy change, I'm not just telling you hypothetically that it could improve people's lives. I can tell you by name the kinds of people whose lives it would improve, and having that sort of, on the ground experience, expertise from the people who are impacted by it most is I think so critically important.
One of the other things that I really appreciate about all of you is that you're not smug in your knowledge. You're each willing to be informed, and you also are very generous to somebody like me, right? Coming to each topic with a bit of ignorance, right? I'm always talking to people who are smarter than me in different ways. And just sort of your grace in allowing me to ask my sometimes fumbling questions and then correcting me and making me smarter is really wonderful. So I'd like to thank Micaela Connery, co-founder and CEO of the Kelsey, Justin Tsang, board member and transportation planning at LA Metro, and Capri Roth, board member and EVP of real estate development at East Bay Asian Local Development Corporation, EBALDC. Thank you so much. Please thank your fellow board members, your fellow staff, your donors, your constituents, and the members of the community who are contributing to shaping the community. That is what community is about. That's what civil society is about. And we so appreciate you sharing your wisdom and insights with us.
Thanks for having us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.